Arthur Schopenhauer was a German philosopher of pessimism. He gave much importance to the idea of will in his metaphysics. Now, he is also the pioneer in what is known as the philosophy of life. Partly the influence he had was from Kant himself. He also had great admiration for Plato. And the influence that Kant had on him through the readings he had done on the works of Kant enabled him to develop what came to be known as a voluntaristic flavor in his thinking. Well, he was not a very successful teacher, however, some of his books have great influence in the subsequent thinkers. One such major work is called The World as Will and Idea. This book he published in 1818. Of course, there are other important books like The Freedom of the Will, The Foundation of Morality, and so on. So let us now begin with this idea that he has, namely the world as will and idea. How does Schopenhauer arrives at this conclusion? Schopenhauer makes an analogy between himself and the world. And the analogy is this. He told himself that I know myself as consisting of body and will. And as I am part of the world too must be constituted like myself. So he makes an analogy between the self, the I, existing I, and the existing world. So the I, the self, has both body and will. The body he calls is the phenomenon, that which is observable in the Kantian sense of the term. The will is noumenon, which you cannot observe. So also in the world, you have the world as a physical reality, as a body, which is observable, but it also has a will. Now, what is the meaning of this word will? Oftentimes, we make in philosophy the distinction between faculty of reason and faculty of will. So obviously, will is contrasted with rationality. So therefore, for Schopenhauer, will is a non-rational force. At the same time, it is an impulse. It is a striving for existence. Hence, will is always will to be. Now, you can see the idea of will in Schopenhauer as later also shaped Nietzsche's idea of will to power. Now, here it is will to be. The will to be, therefore, does not belong only to the rational beings because everything has this will to be, this impulse, this strive for existence. So, therefore, it would belong to animals, plants, and even inanimate things. The will implies that the reality has a dynamic character. And this dynamic character can be manifested differently in different aspects of reality. The moments that we experience in the whole of reality, these moments are nothing other than the manifestations of will itself. And therefore, the will expresses in every organism in the preservation of one's own existence and also the perpetuation of one's own species. Now, the will manifests itself differently in different reality, different aspects of reality, and therefore there are various grades and forms of the will that we can notice in this world. There is only one species which wills consciously, and that is the human being. The world as will is a pervasive force, a blind impulse, a striving to be. So this explains why the world is will. But he also says the world is idea as well. Now, the original English, German term he used was Vorstellung. The Germans pronounce the V as F, so it is Vorstellung. So Vorstellung. Now, Vorstellung means anything that is set in front of or presented. So, when the English translation idea, therefore, loses this nuanced meaning. So, from this point of view, idea refers to everything that is presented to the consciousness. Everything is presented to the consciousness as the object of the consciousness. So, the world, therefore, is presented to the subject as an object. Therefore, in this sense, it is the idea, because it is perceived by my consciousness as an object. The way it is set before me. It is set before me to my consciousness as an object. Therefore, we cannot speak of the world in itself. To speak of the world in itself would mean to speak of the world as will, because that is the noumenon. I have no access to that. I can only speak of the world as idea, as perceived by me. So the world as idea is the external aspect of the world, whereas the world as will is the internal aspect, that which is not observable by me, that which is not perceived by me, the world in itself. So this is how he tries to justify his understanding of the world as both will and idea. Schopenhauer also gives an important position to art in his philosophy. According to him, artists are concerned with contemplation. Now, what is contemplation? Contemplation for him is a perception that is will-less perception. Usually, things are looked at from the standpoint of practical interest, social utility, or even moral purpose. Now, all of these perceptions are willful perception. Something is seen as beautiful in and for itself without the will having any role to play. So, therefore, aesthetic observation is concerned not with the multiplicity of individual things, but with some unseen unity and totality. It's a kind of synoptic vision. In art, we are presented with the permanent essential forms of the world. In this sense, according to him, art provides us with a superior knowledge than natural sciences, because in natural sciences, we are not looking for the unity and totality. In natural sciences, what we are doing is we are looking at things from certain point of view, whatever that point of view could be, whether it is of practical interest or otherwise. Whereas in aesthetic observation, it is the unity and totality that we are looking at, and therefore it is of a superior knowledge. He makes a distinction between these two words, sublimity and beauty. Now, sublimity is very difficult to attain. Beauty, rather, you can easily attain beauty, but sublimity is very difficult, that which is sublime. Because it represents a conscious denial of the will. Sublimity somehow, he also says we can contrast sublimity with the idea of charming. Sublimity enables thought, whereas charming excites the will and therefore obstructs the aesthetic pleasure and knowledge. Some of these interesting paintings of the Renaissance period, they are, for him, they are charming. For example, some of these, naked paintings which Renaissance upheld very much, they are charming. They excite your will or your emotion, but they do not enable thought. But for example, certain other, the Madonna of Raphael or the Pieta of Michelangelo, These things would be for him the examples of sublimity. Now, this seems to be a little arbitrary kind of division. Why these things are considered sublime and the other things are considered merely charming. I think it's a matter of choice that he made. There is no real reason he gives to say this is sublime and that is merely charming. Now, be that as it may, the distinction is what is important. The distinction is that which is sublime enables thinking. It provokes your thinking in some way, whereas that which is charming, also beautiful, that is basically something that excites your will. Arthur Schopenhauer is well known for his philosophy of pessimism. Now, he is a pessimist not because he had a particular kind of temperament, but this philosophy of pessimism that he had is a logical conclusion supported by certain experiential facts. Now, if the world is ultimately will, and will itself indicates a certain want, the craving of the will remains greater than what it can achieve, than its reach. So therefore, the craving is unlimited, but the fulfillment is only limited. Now, this is the reason why the world is experienced as a world of suffering. Because on the one hand, there is an unlimited craving, but on the other hand, the fulfillment of the craving is only limited. There is a gap. When there is a gap, obviously, there is an experience of suffering. So the creatures do not have any significance except the will to live. But after birth, they know they tend towards death. And Schopenhauer thinks it is this fear of death that has caused religion and even popular metaphysics that tries to deny the emptiness of life, that tries to deny that life is a vacuum, because we all tend towards death. So we are all ready to do anything to preserve its existence even at the cost of others. We all desperately pursue what we will, that means existing continuously, unlimitedly, without even understanding it is worthless. Schopenhauer even thinks that pleasure and joy are negative realities. They are merely illusions. What are positive realities are just pain, sorrow, and anxieties. So the whole question of image of paradise and so on is merely an illusion. What is true is the real suffering that we have. What is real? And therefore he also gives an example of the biblical story of Job. Well, if you are not aware of it, you can always browse it and check. That is filled with suffering, and that for him represents the reality. That has a flavor of reality. So this is how the pessimism comes into his work, because the will is unlimited in the sense its craving is unlimited, but the fulfillment is limited. Therefore, what is real is suffering, and obviously death, and we try to deny it by some way or the other and try to somehow preserve life, even it means it costs something for others. But all these things are absolutely worthless, because all these things are illusions. Pleasure and joy are just illusions. They are only negative realities. They are not positive. What is positive is suffering and pain. In this context, Schopenhauer also discusses the idea of religion and even ethics. Religions deny the facts of existence as essential suffering. It tries to somehow deny the reality of suffering in existence. And it offers a kind of flight from this world of will, and it calls this a salvation. So religions formed an image of God and a philosophy to support their views. All the religions, in fact, somehow think the world is a place of suffering, but their teachings were later mispresented, wrapped in a rosy optimism by the followers. How do they do that? They always think about there is a way in which religion can offer you salvation, freedom from this suffering. And that is a mispresentation according to him. Thoughts about gods arise in humans as ideas of possible deliverers from what they dread, including death, obviously. So you need to posit a God in order that you can somehow deal with this fact of death and even suffering. And that's obviously the way it is played out in religions, all kinds of religions. Therefore, religion will become meaningless once people realize life is doomed to an end and suffering. I mean, you simply need to embrace this pessimism. You don't try to create a rosy optimism, and then the more and more you create a rosy optimism, the more and more you are going to create an illusion, and therefore more and more religion will have its hold. But rather, once you realize and acknowledge the fact that life is doomed to an end and suffering, then religion becomes obsolete. Schopenhauer also thinks that the world has a moral sense in which it paves the way for salvation. Now, this morality for him should not be based on the principles of God or theological principles, nor about the idea of eternal reward or punishment. There is normally this, within the theistic framework, people would say, well, why you should be moral? Because God will give you reward in the afterlife, or he will get punished. In simple terms, they will say heaven and hell or whatever it is. So from this point of view, for him, even Kant's teaching is not a valid basis for morality, because it emphasized the idea of duty, the categorical imperative, which for him, the categorical imperative, which means you shall do this categorically. I mean, that means there is no exception to whatsoever, which is a mere reiteration of the Christian Bible. It is only the spirit of Bible it recaptures Kantian morality in that sense, because it's all about the commandments, which is part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, thinks differently, namely that we live in a world of suffering due to our will. The will or desire may be curbed through a deliberate act. Now, you can really curb this will by consciously trying to do something, deliberately doing something. And there are at least three ways in which this curbing may be done. The first way is by having compassion or sympathy. Now, what does it mean to say that to have compassion or sympathy? That you are able to move beyond your own will to the will of others. So there is an ability in which you can transcend your ego, so by which your own will is curbed. The second way is aesthetic contemplation of beauty. So the more and more you are into this contemplation, the will-less perception, that is not exciting your will or emotion, but it is enabling you to think. You are able to break away your enslavement to will. And the will has chained you into slavery. Now you can break away, because now you are getting into the will-less perception. You are having the aesthetic completion which enables your thinking, not so much excites your emotion. The third is by practice of asceticism. This is another way by which you can shatter or clip the wings of the will. Therefore, asceticism is not for some kind of future happiness, but this is to stop willing so that you can already reach a state of salvation. Now, if you may notice, one can immediately perceive that Schopenhauer is very much influenced by a certain kind of Indian philosophy, in particular the Buddhist philosophy. So it is Buddhism that spoke about, you know, the whole idea of suffering in some way. The world is full of suffering, and also there is a way of getting out of suffering. Of course, it worked it in your own. It also presented this morality, in terms of eightfold path. And here, of course, he has appropriated some of those ideas, and then even to the extent of using that idea of compassion and sympathy, which is very Buddhistic again. To some extent, obviously, the idea of asceticism as well. Aesthetic contemplation, I don't know much about the Buddhist literature on that part, but probably it is also there. But he has well read Buddhism, by the way. He was well aware of the Indian philosophy and particularly Buddhism. So to conclude Schopenhauer brought philosophy to every ordinary human person. But unfortunately, his philosophy of life is strangled by his pessimism. However, it is his voluntaristic pessimism, because it is a pessimism that is based on the idea of will, that gave some kind of triumphant march of Hegel's rationalistic optimism. So here there is a voluntaristic pessimism that is based on the will, whereas in Hegel, we had the optimism which is rationalistic. Therefore, this has kind of challenged it, Hegel's rationalistic optimism. In that sense, it's a kind of balancing act. It is rightly said that the intellectualistic conception of the human fell sick with Rousseau, took a bed with Kant, and died with Schopenhauer. So this is a commonly said expression among the philosophers. The intellectual conception of the human fell sick with Rousseau, the political philosopher, took to bed with Kant, it lied paralyzed, and died with Schopenhauer. Obviously, his influence on Nietzsche somehow enhanced his status as a philosopher, because Nietzsche has definitely taken the idea of will. But of course, Nietzsche developed in a completely different sense. But nevertheless, he has definitely influenced Nietzsche, and that is for this reason Nietzsche, along with Schopenhauer, is also considered a philosopher of life. With this, I conclude my brief lecture on Arthur Schopenhauer.